My name is Kathy. I was living alone at the time, in a rented house. There were maybe 6 or 7 other houses scattered along the same rural road, each sitting back from the pavement with long driveways, trees between them, and no sidewalks or streetlights. At night, the road went fully dark. During the day, it was quiet enough that you noticed every car that passed. I had moved there in my late 20s for work. I'd grown up in a more populated area, but my job didn't require me to be close to the city, and rent was cheaper the farther out you went. The house itself was small but well kept. 1 floor, 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a living room that looked out onto the front yard. Behind the house was a line of trees and then open land that belonged to a farmer a few miles down the road. I worked standard hours, came home around the same time every evening, cooked dinner, watched television, and went to bed early. On weekends I cleaned, did laundry, sometimes visited my mother and sister who lived about 40 minutes away. I wasn't especially social, but I wasn't hiding from anyone either. It was a calm period of my life, and I liked that. The neighbors were friendly in the distant way people often are in rural places. We waved when we passed each other. Sometimes we talked briefly about weather or road conditions. I knew who lived where, but not much beyond that. No one showed up unannounced, and no one had a reason to. That's why the first encounter stood out as much as it did. It was a weekday afternoon. I'd taken a half-day off work and was home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen, still wearing my work clothes, when I heard footsteps outside. Close to the front of the house, I assumed it was a delivery truck or someone at the wrong address. Then I heard a knock. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. A man was standing on the porch, closer to the door than most people stand. He was facing straight ahead, not looking around or shifting his weight. He had on dark pants and a light jacket. Nothing about his clothes stood out as unusual, but his posture did. He was very still. I didn't open the door right away. I asked who it was. He didn't answer immediately. There was a pause, just long enough that I wondered if he'd heard me. Then he said something about being a salesman. I asked what he was selling. He didn't answer that question either. Instead, he knocked again, this time closer to the door handle, like he was emphasizing the door itself rather than trying to get my attention. I told him I wasn't interested and that I didn't open the door to salespeople. That's when I noticed his hand move. He reached toward the handle and gave it a quick turn, like he was checking to see if it was unlocked. It wasn't. It struck me as rude, not threatening. I raised my voice and told him the door was locked and he needed to leave. He said something then, but it didn't answer anything I'd asked. It was a vague sentence about a product and a limited opportunity. I couldn't even tell you what it was supposed to be. There was no company name, no explanation, nothing concrete. I asked him again what he was selling and who he worked for. He didn't respond. He stood there for another moment, then stepped back, walked off the porch, and went down the driveway toward the road. I watched through the front window until he disappeared from view. I didn't see a vehicle. I assumed he parked farther down the road or walked. After that, I locked the door and went back to what I was doing. I told myself it was just a pushy salesman who didn't understand boundaries. I mentioned it to my mother later that week, more as an odd interaction than anything else. Time passed. Weeks went by without anything else happening. My routine stayed the same. I stopped thinking about the man entirely. A few months later, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't in an envelope with postage like normal mail. It was just sitting in my mailbox, folded neatly. There was no return address and no name written anywhere. Inside was a short note, handwritten, wishing me good luck on my new job. That was it. No explanation, no signature. I stood in the kitchen reading it a few times, trying to understand how anyone would know about my job. I hadn't started yet. I'd accepted an offer recently, but I hadn't told many people. My family knew. A couple of close friends knew. None of them lived nearby. I told myself someone might have overheard something. Maybe I'd mentioned it at work or on the phone while outside. It didn't feel convincing, but I didn't have another explanation. I threw the letter away and went on with my day. I started locking my doors more carefully. I double-checked windows before bed. It wasn't panic, just a subtle shift in awareness. Another few months passed. One evening when I got home from work, I noticed a small package on the porch. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was wrapped in plain brown paper and sealed with tape. It looked like something someone could have put together at home. I hesitated before picking it up. Packages weren't common where I lived unless you were expecting one. I carried it inside and opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside was a piece of clothing, a bra. It took me a moment to recognize it, then I did. I had lost it months earlier. I remembered looking for it one morning and assuming it had gotten mixed in with something else at the laundromat or fallen behind the washer. It wasn't expensive or distinctive, but it was mine. I was sure of it. I sat down at the table and tried to think through every possible explanation. Had I dropped it somewhere? Had someone accidentally taken it and returned it? That didn't explain the note or how it ended up on my porch without a word. That was the first time I felt genuinely unsettled. I called my mother and told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment, then suggested I call the police. I didn't want to, but the more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. I called the non-emergency line and explained the situation. There were no threats, no damage, no clear suspect. Suggested I stay alert and call again if anything else happened. For a while, nothing did. Then one evening, I came home and found my front door unlocked. I was certain I'd locked it that morning. I stood on the porch for a long moment before going inside, listening for any sound. Nothing looked disturbed. I walked through each room carefully. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. I locked the door and sat in the living room, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself I must have forgotten. People forget things all the time. But the truth was, I was meticulous about locking up. I slept at my mother's house that night. The next day, I talked to one of my neighbors, a man who lived a few houses down and had a doorbell camera installed. I hadn't thought to mention it earlier because I didn't know he had one. I told him what was going on, and he offered to check his footage from the night before. He invited me inside and pulled up the video on his phone. The footage showed a man dressed in dark clothing walking up my driveway. The timestamp matched the evening I found the door unlocked. He approached the front door, paused briefly, then opened it and went inside. He didn't come back out. The camera angle didn't show my entire porch, but it showed enough to be clear. The man didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He moved like he'd done it before. I called the police again. This time they took it more seriously. Officers came out, reviewed the footage, and searched the house. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints they could use, nothing conclusive. I packed a bag that night and went to stay with my mother and sister. I didn't go back to that house alone again. I moved out. The lease ended early with the landlord's permission. Never found out who the man was or what he wanted. The case went nowhere. I was 27 when this happened. I'm Madison, and my life at that point was fairly ordinary in a way that felt stable to me. I'd grown up in the same general region where this took place, a mix of small towns and wooded stretches broken up by shopping centers and older neighborhoods. You needed a car to get most places. I was working full-time then, an office job that paid enough for a small apartment and left me tired most evenings. My social life was nothing dramatic. I had a handful of close friends, most of whom I'd known since college, and we did what people our age usually did: dinners, birthdays, the occasional party when someone had the energy to host. I wasn't reckless. I didn't drink much. I didn't chase excitement. I usually trusted my judgment. The night this happened started as one of those low expectation plans you agree to because it sounds fine, not because you're excited. A friend of mine, I'll call her Lauren, invited me to a party at a place owned by a coworker of hers. It wasn't a house party in the typical sense. The property was set back from the road, near a wooded area, and people often parked wherever there was space, along a gravel pull-off, near a tree line, or in a rough lot that had a couple of benches and a clearing. It was used for events often enough that no one thought much about it. Lauren drove us there. We arrived early enough that it was still dark but not late. Everything was normal. Music, people talking too loudly, drinks on a folding table. I stayed for a while, made conversation, and tried to enjoy myself. After about an hour, I realized I wasn't really in the mood. I felt tired. I had work the next morning. Lauren was clearly planning to stay longer, and I didn't want to rush her. We talked it over, and I decided I'd wait outside. The idea was simple. She'd come out when she was ready, and we'd leave together. My phone battery was already low, but I didn't think much of it. I told her where I'd be and stepped out. Outside, the noise dropped away almost completely. The house lights didn't reach far, and the parking area was darker than I remembered. There were a few cars still coming and going, but most people were inside by then. I walked over to one of the benches near the edge of the clearing. Beyond it was a line of trees that went back farther than you could see without a flashlight. I sat there scrolling on my phone for a while, mostly killing time. It wasn't particularly cold, but the air had that damp nighttime heaviness. I was thinking that I should have brought a jacket, but it didn't feel urgent enough to go back inside. At some point, headlights swept across the clearing, and a car pulled in. A man and a woman got out. They didn't say much to each other. I noticed them only because there wasn't much else to notice. They went inside the house, stayed for like 15 or 20 minutes, then came back out. Nothing about them stood out immediately. They weren't loud or drunk. They didn't look like they were arguing. If anything, they seemed a little tense, but that could have been my imagination filling in blanks. They got back into their car and drove off. I went back to my phone. Time passed in a way that didn't feel long while it was happening, but feels long when I think back on it. Eventually, my battery dipped low enough that I stopped using it and just sat there. I heard footsteps behind me. I assumed it was someone heading back to their car. That seemed like the obvious explanation. I didn't turn around right away. I stayed seated, waiting for them to pass. Instead, the steps stopped directly behind the bench. Before I could stand or even turn fully, a hand came down on my shoulder, firm enough to stop me from moving. I felt pressure near my neck, something cold and solid. The man's voice was close to my ear. He told me to stand up slowly and not make a sound. I didn't scream. I didn't think about screaming. My body did what it was told, almost automatically. When I stood, I saw the knife in his other hand. He held it low, angled toward me, not waving it around. He didn't need to. He told me to walk with him to the car. I said no. He pressed the knife closer, just enough that I could feel it through my clothing. I remember being aware of how steady his hand was. The woman was waiting by the car, already holding the door open. She didn't look surprised to see me. She didn't look at me much at all. Her eyes kept darting around the clearing like she was checking for witnesses. I hesitated. I tried to step back. My legs didn't respond the way I wanted them to. The man shoved me forward, not hard enough to knock me down, but hard enough to make it clear I didn't have a choice. I got into the back seat. They climbed in after me. The doors shut. The car started moving almost immediately. I asked where we were going. No one answered. The woman drove. The man sat in the front passenger seat, twisted halfway around to watch me. He kept the knife visible, resting it casually against his leg. My phone was still in my hand. He noticed it and took it from me without comment, tossing it into the front console. We drove away from the house, away from the light, onto a road that cut through the trees. I tried to keep track of turns, but it didn't take long before everything blurred together. I didn't recognize where we were. I asked again what they wanted. The woman told me to be quiet. Her voice was tight, clipped. The man told her to calm down. She snapped something back that I couldn't hear clearly. They started arguing. It was the kind of argument where both people are trying to control their voices and failing slightly. I caught fragments. Words like hide, move, sell. The man accused her of rushing things. She accused him of being careless. They didn't talk about me directly, but they talked like I was part of the problem they were trying to solve. I sat still. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I don't know if that helped or hurt. I was focused on staying aware, on not doing anything that might escalate the situation. The argument got sharper. The woman missed a turn. The man yelled at her. She swerved too hard trying to correct it. The car left the road. The front end slammed into a tree with enough force to stop us cold. The airbags didn't deploy, but the impact knocked the breath out of me. Everything went quiet except for the engine, which stalled. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the man cursed and shoved the door open. He didn't look back at me. He yelled at the woman to get out. She hesitated, then followed him. They ran. I stayed in the car stunned, my body buzzing from the impact. I expected them to come back. I waited for footsteps. When nothing happened, I forced myself to move. The door on my side was stuck, but the other back door opened. I got out, my legs shaking so badly I had to grab the frame to steady myself. We were on a narrow stretch of road, trees pressing in on both sides. The car's headlights were still on, illuminating the trunk of the tree we'd hit and nothing else. I could hear insects, distant and constant. I shouted for help. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears. There was no response. I started walking. I didn't know which direction was better, so I picked one and stuck with it. After what felt like a long time, I saw lights ahead, houses spaced far apart. I knocked on the first door I reached. A man answered. He looked startled when he saw me, disheveled and shaking. I told him I'd been in an accident. I told him my phone was taken. I didn't tell him everything right away. He let me inside and called the police. When they arrived, I explained what happened as calmly as I could. They took me back to the car. They searched the area. They found the knife on the ground near the crash site. They found my phone inside the car. They didn't find the couple. Over the next few days, I gave statements. I worked with a sketch artist. I answered the same questions repeatedly. The police told me they were taking it seriously, that cases like this sometimes took time. They were never found. Lauren blamed herself for a long time. I told her it wasn't her fault, and I meant it, but we didn't talk much after that. Things like this have a way of creating distance even when no one intends it. I grew up on a working ranch in the western part of the state. The ranch wasn't huge by commercial standards, but for a kid, it felt endless. We had cattle, a few horses, and long stretches of fence that disappeared into scrubland and tree lines. Behind the property, the land sloped upward into a dense patch of forest that technically wasn't ours but might as well have been. Nobody else used it. No trails, no signs, no reason for anyone to be back there. My parents worked constantly. My dad was up before sunrise most days, and my mom handled the books, the animals, and everything else that kept the place running. I was expected to help, but there was also a lot of unsupervised time built into that kind of life. You learn early how to occupy yourself. You learn how far you can wander and still make it home before dark. You learn which fences can be crossed and which ones mean trouble. By the time I was in my late teens, the woods behind the ranch were just part of the routine. Me and my friend Marty spent a lot of time back there, especially during summers. We weren't doing anything especially rebellious. Mostly we'd just walk, talk, mess around, sometimes build stupid little structures out of fallen branches. It felt private in a way, nothing else did. No parents, no neighbors, no rules except the ones you already understood from growing up outdoors. That's where we met Tim. The first time we saw him, neither of us thought much of it. He was standing near a tree line, a little deeper into the woods than we usually went, watching us in a way that felt curious but not aggressive. He looked older than us, lean, with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in a while. His clothes were practical but worn, like he'd been living out of a backpack for a long time. Boots, dark pants. He waved first. That mattered more than I realized at the time. We talked, mostly surface-level stuff. He asked if the land belonged to our family, asked how far the ranch went, asked if people ever came out this way. Nothing that felt intrusive. He introduced himself as Tim, said he lived around here, which I assumed meant somewhere off-grid or in one of the scattered properties farther out. Over the next few days, we ran into him again. Not every time we went into the woods, but often enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence. He was always calm, polite, almost reserved. He never raised his voice, never laughed loudly. He listened more than he spoke. Looking back, what strikes me is how normal it all felt in the moment, like someone you'd see at the same gas station every week and eventually stop thinking about. He talked about the woods like he knew them intimately, which trees dropped branches after storms, where water pooled after rain, which paths animals tended to use. He never said he was homeless, but he talked about shelters and setups and living light. Said he preferred it that way. No bills, no neighbors, no interruptions. Marty thought he was interesting. I was more neutral, not suspicious, but not curious enough to push for details. After a few days, Tim mentioned he had built a place deeper in the woods, a shelter, he called it, though the way he said it made it sound more permanent than a lean-to or tent. He invited us to see it, not in a pushy way, just mentioned it casually, like it might be something we'd want to check out if we were bored. I remember hesitating, but not for any clear reason. There was nothing concrete to point to, just a vague sense that we were crossing some invisible line. Marty was immediately on board. He liked seeing unusual things. He liked stories. So we agreed. Tim led the way. The path he took wasn't one I recognized, even though I knew the woods well. It wasn't marked or cleared, just a route he clearly favored. We walked for a long time, longer than I expected. The trees grew closer together, the ground uneven, the light thinner. It felt quieter, though that might have been in my head. Eventually, we came to a structure that looked wrong before it even fully came into view. It was an old shed, or something that had once been one. The wood was weathered and dark, the roof sagging. It didn't look abandoned in the sense of being forgotten. It looked maintained just enough to keep standing, like someone cared about it not collapsing, but didn't care how it looked. Tim seemed proud. He gestured toward it like someone showing off a finished project. The air smelled stale, thick with smoke residue, and something sour I couldn't place. The light was dim. Candles were everywhere, burned down, melted onto surfaces, pooled wax hardened into uneven shapes. Shelves were lined with canned food, stacked carefully, labels turned inward or peeled off. There were notebooks piled in one corner, some open, some closed. The walls were what caught my attention most. They were covered in writing. Just thoughts, phrases, words scrawled at different heights and angles. Some were philosophical. Some sounded like prayers. Some didn't make sense at all. There were repeated sentences, crossed out and written again, names I didn't recognize. Marty walked around slowly, reading pieces out loud before stopping himself. Tim watched us closely, his expression unreadable. In another corner, hanging from a hook, was clothing. A one-piece jumper, styled like a dress. It was clearly meant for a woman, but it was old, stained, and didn't look like it had been worn in a long time. It didn't belong in that space. It didn't match anything else there. Tim noticed me looking at it and said something vague about keeping things from a past life. He didn't elaborate. Then, he mentioned the basement. He said it casually, like an afterthought. Asked if we wanted to see it. Said he'd been working on it, that it went down farther than you'd expect. I declined immediately. So did Marty. Neither of us offered an excuse. We just said it was fine, that we should probably head back. Tim didn't argue. He nodded, smiled faintly, said maybe another time. As we turned to leave, I caught sight of something at his waist. My brain didn't register it properly. Then it did. It looked like a gun. I didn't stare. I didn't point it out. I just put my hand on Marty's arm and said we should go. My voice sounded normal, even to me. Tim walked us out. He waved goodbye. He told us to be careful heading back. We just walked, faster than before, following our own route this time. When the ranch finally came into view, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized was tense. We never went back into that part of the woods again. You know, years later, I still think about that shed, about how close we were to something that could have ended very differently. And that leaving when we did was probably the only reason we were able to tell anyone about it at all.